They said humiliation was sometimes the strongest weapon in a place where discipline was everything, but nobody inside that parade hall expected what happened that morning. Imagine a room full of cadets, officers, and senior officials, the echo of boots on polished floors, the banners of the academy swaying lightly from the draft of the open windows, and then a silence so heavy that it felt like time itself had paused. At the center of it all stood her, lean, proud, and yet trembling beneath the weight of a punishment she hadn't earned. From the moment they ordered her to stand before the assembly, whispers ran through the crowd like wildfire, young cadets, shifting nervously, some biting their lips, others unable to take their eyes off what was about to unfold. She had been accused of defiance, of questioning authority in a way that bruised the pride of men who wore stars on their shoulders, and in the rigid walls of a military order, such defiance could not go unpunished. They didn't expect her to fight back with her voice or her fists. They expected her to bow her head, accept disgrace, and crumble silently so the message would echo. No one defies command. But as the order came to strip her of her uniform in front of everyone, the energy in the hall shifted from curiosity to a suffocating tension that made even the hardest officers grip the edge of their belts. She clenched her jaw, staring straight ahead, her dark hair falling slightly into her eyes as her breathing steadied. She did not beg, she did not cry, she did not curse. Instead, she held herself with the stubborn stillness of someone carrying a truth too big for anyone around her to understand. Buttons were unfastened, one after another, the fabric of the uniform jacket peeling away, the murmurs of the crowd growing louder, the air thick with the shame that was meant to break her. And yet, when the fabric finally slid down her arms, and her back came into view, the hall did not erupt with laughter or mockery as those orchestrating this moment expected. It erupted with stunned silence. For there, etched into the skin of her back, bold and undeniable, was a tattoo that did not belong to the narrative they had spun about her. The ink spread in sharp lines and intricate patterns, an emblem that every soldier in that room recognized. Instantly, one that tied to a past far deeper and more dangerous than any accusation of defiance. The general who had ordered this punishment and stood tall with his chest out suddenly froze, his lips parting but no words finding their way out. His eyes locked on the tattoo, his mind racing to connect what he was seeing with what he knew but never spoke of. And in that instant, the hall of soldiers realized that the story of the woman standing before them was far bigger than the humiliation they had gathered to witness. The silence that followed was not the silence of boredom or indifference. It was the kind of silence that crushes the air out of your lungs, that makes even the scrape of a chair or the shuffle of boots sound like an explosion. Everyone in that room knew the tattoo, every single one of them, because it wasn't just some decorative mark of youth or rebellion. It was a symbol tied to blood, to sacrifice, to a chapter of their nation's history that was whispered about in cautious tones. The emblem carved into her back was that of the Forgotten Brigade, a clandestine unit believed to have been wiped out years ago, soldiers who had gone on missions from which no one was supposed to return, men and women who were erased from official records as though they had never lived. And yet there it was, unmistakable, sprawled across the skin of the woman who had just been branded as a disobedient cadet. The general's hand, which had been raised moments before in commanding authority, trembled slightly, betraying the icy composure that his medals demanded of him. His lips quivered as he tried to form words, but nothing came. For the younger cadets, most of whom had only heard rumors of the brigade during whispered conversations in the barracks, it was a sight that didn't just puzzle them, it terrified them. They stole glances at one another, wide-eyed, asking, silently, the same question. Who was she? And why would someone like her, carrying that mark, be standing here in their midst? The officers, men hardened by years of combat and training, shifted uneasily, because they knew more than the cadets did. They knew the weight that emblem carried. They knew that if she bore it, it wasn't by accident. No soldier carried that. Mark, unless they had earned it with blood and fire, unless they had been chosen, broken, and reforged in the crucible of missions no one ever spoke about. And the general knew this truth better than anyone else, because he had been one of the architects of that program. He remembered the night when the order came from high command to disband the brigade, to erase every trace of its existence, to silence its soldiers permanently so the secrets they carried would never see daylight. Yet here she stood, alive, defiant, marked forever with the truth that he and his superiors had buried under the rubble of history. His jaw clenched, his eyes flickering between the tattoo and her steady posture, because in her silence she was accusing him more than words ever could. Around them, the crowd of soldiers leaned forward, caught in the grip of a revelation they didn't yet understand, their breathing shallow, their boots scuffing against the floor as if trying to anchor themselves to the reality unfolding before them. The general wanted to bark an order, to demand that everyone turn away, to cover her back, to erase the sight before it could take root in their minds. But he couldn't. The power had shifted, invisibly, but undeniably. She wasn't the cadet, on trial anymore. She was something else, something dangerous, something powerful, something that made the general himself feel the chill of vulnerability that no battlefield had ever managed to inflict on him. And in that crushing stillness, she slowly lifted her head and turned her gaze toward him, her eyes calm but burning with a truth that only the two of them seemed to fully comprehend. And for the first time in his long, decorated career, the general felt fear bloom in his chest. The general's fear was not lost on the people who watched him, and that more than the tattoo itself unsettled them. He was a man who had built his reputation on never flinching, never hesitating, never once letting weakness seep through the steel of his posture. Yet now his stare was locked on her back as though he was facing not a cadet, but a ghost from a past he had hoped would never resurface. The younger cadets whispered in hushed tones, the sound like the faint rustling of leaves in a windless forest, and their uncertainty spread like smoke through the hall. Some craned their necks to get a clearer view, others turned away as though fearful that simply looking at her would brand them guilty of some unspoken crime. The officers, however, weren't whispering. They stood rigid, arms crossed behind. Their backs, eyes narrowed, not in confusion but in calculation. They were veterans, men who knew that silence could be more dangerous than words, and they could feel the fragile balance of authority cracking right before them. One of them cleared, his throat as though to break the unbearable stillness, but the sound died quickly under the weight of the tattoo's presence. She didn't move. Her back remained exposed, her shoulders square. Her chin lifted slightly higher now, as though she knew every heartbeat in that room belonged to her. And she was right. Because while the general's authority had dragged her into the center of the hall to strip her down and humiliate her, what now held the room in its grip was not his power but hers. The emblem had spoken louder than his commands. It had whispered of battles no one admitted had happened, of loyalties forged in places the government swore did not exist, of sacrifices too inconvenient to be honored in public. The more they stared, the clearer it became that this was not a mistake, not some meaningless tattoo. It was a statement, a living scar on the conscience of the institution itself. The general finally forced himself to step forward, his boots echoing with a heaviness that betrayed the storm in his chest. He opened his mouth, but the words that came out were brittle, shaky, as if he were choking on ashes. "Where did you get that, Mark?" His question was not a command, it was almost a plea. She didn't turn around, didn't rush to answer. Instead, her voice came low, calm, and steady, carrying across the hall like a blade gliding over stone. "You know where." A ripple ran through the crowd, cadets' jaws dropping, officers shifting uncomfortably, and the general's face blanching pale under the harsh lights. That voice, those words, they weren't defiance, they were revelation. And in them was the suggestion that everything the academy stood for, everything the general claimed to embody, was built on a foundation of lies that she, with one silent show of her back, could shatter. The silence that followed was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of anticipation, of something about to break open, of a truth no one was ready for but everyone knew was inevitable. The general's throat tightened as he stared at her, his mind clawing backward through the years, through the shadows of missions that had never made it into reports, through faces he had ordered forgotten. He could almost hear the rain pounding against tin roofs from that night long ago, could almost smell the smoke and ash of villages left in silence after operations stamped classified. And among those memories, there was a girl, barely. More than a teenager then, who had survived when no one was meant to survive. His fingers twitched at his side, not from age but from recognition, from the gut-wrenching possibility that the woman standing before him now was the ghost of that survivor, grown, hardened, and marked with the same emblem that had haunted his dreams for years. Around him, the cadets leaned on every detail of the moment like moths drawn to a flame. They didn't understand the history, but they sensed it, sensed that their general, the immovable pillar of their academy, was unraveling. The officers did understand, at least pieces of it. They had heard whispers in smoky back rooms of soldiers who had refused to die, of a unit that had been abandoned by command, of survivors who had sworn vengeance, though none had ever been found. And now one stood here, stripped of her uniform, but not her dignity, her bare back branded with truth, in ink that could not be denied. The general's lips parted again, this time to bark an order to the guards nearby, but his voice cracked in a way that betrayed him before he even spoke. "Cover her," he managed, though it was not the command of authority, but the plea of a man cornered by his own past. No one moved. The soldiers frozen around her weren't sure whether to obey because to cover her now felt like an admission, a concession that what they saw was too powerful, too dangerous to be exposed. She finally turned slowly, her eyes locking with the general's, and in that gaze was a storm, rage and sorrow and something deeper still, a fire born of betrayal. "You buried us," she said, her voice sharp enough to slice through the still air. "But we were never dead." The words hit the hall like cannon fire, and cadets gasped as though struck themselves. The general's knees nearly buckled, because he knew she was right. He had signed the papers, stamped the orders, erased the files. He had told himself it was for the greater good, that the nation needed clean hands, not stained truths. Yet here she stood, the living embodiment of those stains, forcing him to see what he had done, what he had tried to hide under medals and ceremony. The crowd could feel it too. The academy wasn't just witnessing a punishment anymore. They were watching a reckoning. Every pair of eyes darted between the two figures, the decorated general whose voice had ruled their lives, and the stripped cadet whose tattoo now held more authority than his rank. Somewhere in the silence, someone whispered a prayer. Someone else clenched their fists, and the weight of history pressed down on the room until it was almost unbearable. The general's chest rose and fell in uneven rhythm, every breath dragging, like a weight across his ribs as he faced the cadet who was no longer just a cadet, but a reminder of everything he had tried to bury. The hall seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing tighter with every second of silence, the banners above drooping lower as if even they were ashamed of what the moment revealed. He tried to summon anger, to lean on the discipline of decades, of command, to find his voice in the authority that had carried him through wars, but all he could find was guilt gnawing at the edges of his control. The cadets stared at him, their eyes wide, waiting for his next move, and for the first time in his career, he felt their faith flickering, fragile, uncertain. They had believed him unshakable, believed that nothing could penetrate the armor of his rank, but the tattoo on her back had cracked him open like a blade splitting wood. She didn't flinch beneath his stare. Instead, she stepped forward, her bare feet whispering against the polished floor, every movement deliberate, steady, a soldier's march even without a uniform. Her words came again, softer this time, but cutting deeper than any scream could. You told the world we were gone. You left us to die so you could live with your medals clean. And now you want to cover me? Her voice carried into every corner of the hall, curling around the ears of the cadets who would never forget it. A shiver ran through the room, because though they didn't know the full story, they felt the truth in her tone, and truth has a way of echoing louder than commands. The general's hand rose, shaking, as though he might order her dragged away, silenced before she could speak another word. But then he froze again, because as she turned fully to face him, he saw more ink running along her collarbone, just peeking into view. A second mark, different from the brigade's emblem, one he recognized even more viscerally. His stomach dropped. It was the personal insignia of a comrade, a soldier from the brigade who had been closer than a brother to him, one who had disappeared during the final operation, a man he had sworn was lost. The realization carved through him like ice. She wasn't just a survivor of the brigade. She was connected by blood, by legacy, to the very people he had sacrificed. Gasps rippled through the hall as others noticed the second tattoo, as recognition spread among the older officers who had lived through that time. The cadets felt the energy shift again, heavier, darker, as though history itself had stepped into the room. The general staggered half a step back, his boots scuffing against the stone floor, his aura of invincibility dimming with every heartbeat. He wanted to deny it, to claim it was fake, a trick, anything. But the weight in his gut told him it was real. He could feel the ghosts pressing in, could hear their voices in his memory, could see their faces staring at him through her eyes. The cadet's jaw tightened, her lips curling slightly in something between defiance and grief. "He was my father," she whispered, just loud enough for the front rows to hear, and the words ignited through the assembly like fire through dry grass. The cadets' gasps turned into murmurs. The officers' rigid stares faltered, and the general's world tilted off its axis. She was no ordinary soldier. She was the daughter of the man he had abandoned, the daughter of the comrade whose death had been the cost of his career, the daughter of a truth that no amount of medals or authority could erase. The words landed like a blow across the general's face, heavier than any fist, sharper than any blade, and for the first time in decades, he could not steady himself with discipline or duty. His knees felt weak, as though the ground beneath him was threatening to split open and swallow him whole. The officers at his side stiffened, some exchanging glances that betrayed the storm brewing in their own memories because they, too, had known the man she spoke of, the soldier whose death had been quietly brushed aside as a necessary sacrifice for the sake of politics. And now here was his daughter, standing half-stripped in front of the academy, bearing not just her skin, but the shameful truth engraved on it. The cadets leaned forward as if pulled by invisible threads, their eyes wide with horror and awe, because this was no longer about discipline, no longer about a punishment for disobedience. This was about history colliding with the present, about buried lies clawing their way into daylight, about a truth too powerful to be contained by rank or ceremony. The general's lips trembled as he tried to speak, but his voice betrayed him, breaking apart under the weight of guilt. He was a hero, he muttered, though the words felt thin, empty, a weak offering in the face of the living proof of betrayal standing before him. The cadet's eyes narrowed, and she stepped closer, her shadow stretching across the polished floor until it touched his boots. "You don't get to call him that," she hissed, her voice fierce but steady, her tone carrying decades of pain, passed down like a curse. "You left him. You left all of them." The silence that followed was deafening, thick enough to choke, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Some of the older officers closed their eyes, remembering the orders, the decisions, the compromises that had led to that night, while the younger cadets stared in disbelief at the unraveling of a man they had worshipped as unshakable. The general's chest heaved, his face pale, his hand clutching at the edge of his coat as if it could anchor him against the tide of shame washing over him. He wanted to deny her words, to crush her defiance, but every line on her back, every mark of ink, every syllable in her voice echoed with truth. And truth was something even he could not command away. "Enough," he whispered, though it was unclear if he was speaking to her, to the soldiers, or to the ghosts that crowded around him in his own mind. But she didn't stop. She straightened her shoulders, the light catching on the sweat that traced down her skin, her voice ringing out louder now. "You built your throne on their bones, and I will not let you bury me the way you buried them." The hall shivered with her words, the cadets clutching at their belts, the officers shifting uncomfortably, the entire academy teetering on the edge of collapse. For in that moment, the general was no longer the one in control. She was. And every soldier in that room knew it. The general's breath rattled in his chest, his carefully built walls of discipline and pride crumbling faster than he could hold. Them together, and for the first time since the academy had been built, the soldiers inside it were not looking at him with respect or fear, but with doubt. That doubt spread like a sickness, like cracks racing across glass, because once a leader bleeds weakness, no amount of medals can stop the truth from seeping out. The cadet, no, the daughter of the man he had betrayed, stood unwavering, her bare back marked with the history he had erased, her eyes burning with a fire older than her years. And in that fire was not just anger, but the unspoken voices of the dead, voices that had been silenced in smoke and ash, voices that refused to stay buried. The general's lips quivered as he tried to summon his old authority, to bark orders and remind everyone of their place, but his throat closed as if the ghosts themselves had wrapped their hands around it. He could feel sweat sliding down his temples, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides, his heart pounding so loudly he wondered if the cadets could hear it. She, in contrast, stood still as stone, her silence more commanding than his decades of speeches. When she finally spoke, her voice trembled not with fear, but with strength that came from carrying pain too heavy for one person alone. "You thought you could bury the brigade," she said, her words slicing through the heavy air. "But here I stand, and every time you look at me, you will see them." Gasps rippled through the crowd, some cadets covering their mouths, others gripping the straps of their uniforms as if grounding themselves in the moment. The older officers' eyes fell to the floor, some in shame, some in quiet respect, but none dared interrupt her. And the general, once the immovable rock of the academy, took a step back, his boots scraping against the stone, the sound louder than any drumbeat. His mind reeled, flashing with memories of his comrade's laugh, the last time he had seen, his face the moment he had signed the order that condemned them all. He felt it now, the weight of betrayal pressing down so hard he could barely stand. She stepped closer again, until there was barely a breath between them, her eyes locking into his. And in them he saw not only the man he had lost, but also his own reflection, broken, cowardly, and exposed. The hall seemed to vanish around them. There were no cadets, no officers, no banners, just him and her, the past and the present colliding. And when her voice came one last time, it was not a shout, not a scream, but a whisper filled with the force of 1,000 unspoken truths. "Your reign ends today." The silence afterward was absolute, a silence so thick it swallowed every sound in the room, until slowly, almost hesitantly, one cadet stepped forward and bowed his head, not to the general, but to her. Another followed, and another, until a wave of lowered heads spread through the hall like a tide, a silent declaration of where their loyalty now lay. The general's face drained of color, his body trembling as he realized the truth. He was no longer the pillar of this place. He had been dethroned, not by war, not by an enemy nation, but by the daughter of a comrade he had betrayed, by the ink on her back, by the truth he could no longer deny. And in that hall, under the watchful eyes of soldiers who would never forget, what they had seen, the general froze, not as a commander, not as a leader, but as a man stripped bare, haunted forever by the ghost he could never bury.